I am issuing an arrest warrant for the masked vigilante known as Spider-Man.
I'm in trouble.
Hello and welcome to your award-winning The Reasons I'm Broke podcast, bringing you the reasons we're broke every single week, normally through news and headlines, but this week we have a Patreon first episode, and this is a retrospective as voted on by the Patreon backers, The Amazing Spider-Man, as directed by Mark Webb, who did 500 Days of Summer, and with me today on this Patreon first, we have Bobby.
Hello, Briquettes. How's everybody doing? Glad to be here. Thanks, Daniel.
And we got two co-hosts as well. So we got Millennial Mike joining.
Double the trouble. Or no, what does Team Rocket say? Something and make it double. You're the Pokemon guy. You're supposed to know that.
Yeah. No, I know it.
How's it going, guys?
Mike, you were especially excited to do The Amazing Spider-Man, and Bobby, you jumped on to volunteer as well to be on for this one. So this one I am excited to review or talk about in this retrospective. All three options. This one won out against Interstellar and American Psycho, but the Patreon backers voted for The Amazing Spider-Man, which I am perfectly happy with, especially since there's a lot of Andrew Garfield talk going on right now. This one was written by James Vanderbilt, who recently did Scream 2022. Apparently it's doing pretty well in the box office. That one surprised me. Also written by Alvin Sargent, who did Spider-Man 2, and Steve Kloves, who did Harry Potter 1 through 7. This stars Andrew Garfield, known for Hacksaw Ridge, Emma Stone, known for La La Land, Rhys Ifans from Notting Hill, and Dennis Leary from Rescue Me. So the way we're going to be doing this retrospective is it's going to be a very basic breakdown. It's going to be very loose, but the categories we're going to touch on are our first impressions overall after having watched it for, in my case, several years, maybe less time for both of you. We're going to talk about this version's Peter Parker and Spider-Man, so the reboot and how it's different from anything we may have read or seen on the big screen, the story overall, and finally the action and special effects. The finale of the episode will be talking about some Spider-Man trivia, so some fun stuff that happened while they were making the film or things that were discovered. So kicking things off, our first overall impressions, let's start off with Bobby. How long had it been since you had last seen The Amazing Spider-Man, and did you have some changes in opinions after having rewatched it?
It's been a while. I haven't watched it since it came out. I saw it in the theaters originally upon first release. I just watched it today, actually, a little while before we recorded, so it was a good refresher. I gotta say, like, watching a movie that far apart, you see it a different way, especially if you're trying to judge it and look at it from a different perspective, because you've already watched and enjoyed the movie once. You're not expecting any surprises. So it's just like any other movie that you may watch, like having the opportunity, I should say, to watch a movie and dissect it without trying to understand it the first time you watch it is a little bit different. So I enjoyed it just as much this time as I did before. So it's been, 7 years since I've seen it?
Yeah. What year was this? 2013 or something?
Actually, it was 2012. So it's been almost 12
10 years.
10 years, yeah. Math is hard.
How about you, Millennial Mike?
Yeah, the movie was just as great as I recall it being when I first saw it. I remember back when the movie was first announced and they were releasing pictures and like the pictures of the Spider-Man suit. I was really enthralled and I was really on board with it pretty much as soon as it came out. I was always a big Spider-Man fan. As I've talked about on this podcast and other podcasts, I've always been, a Spider-Man fan first and foremost when it comes to comics. So I was always really, really on board. I loved Andrew Garfield. I'm trying to think if I had watched his works prior to seeing that, or if I really became to love him after I saw that movie. I probably got onto the Andrew Garfield train after I saw that movie originally. But nevertheless, just hearing the score kind of reminded me how great the movie sounded, and seeing the effects and everything like that. It just reminded me again about, why I really like the movie, the acting performances. It's such a solid movie overall. I'm kind of the guy who likes to go into the weeds of stuff. So you ask me overall questions, and I'm like, well, I can't give you anything less than a paragraph. But yeah, it's a great movie. I do actually have maybe a few small nitpicks with it now that I'm watching it again, and perhaps the time I've spent away from the movie and since then has kind of informed some of my opinions on it now. But hopefully we'll be able to get into some of those as we go through the review.
Yeah, some of those in mind, because I did have some issues with it as I rewatched it, are in the story itself, which we will get to. And it had been several years as well for me. This wasn't either Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 or 2, I don't own. I don't think I own even the original trilogy with the Raimi ones. I have them on DVD from when I was growing up, but I never bought them on 4K or Blu-ray. So going back and really rewatching this after having seen so many superhero movies in between then and now, it really kind of informed me on how much of an impression the Nolan universe made, because this seemed like a more grounded take on Spider-Man than what we had seen in the Raimi films. And even up to this point, I'd only seen Homecoming from the new trilogy, but that seems more like comic booky and not as grounded as this first Amazing Spider-Man. So that I really appreciated, because in that time, that's what a lot of people were looking for, and that was considered what was successful. That Nolan trilogy made the money, and that's what set the path for superhero films at that time. And I also noticed this time how much this is like a teen romance. And I know Mark Webb, 500 Days of Summer, you can see why he was chosen for this. And thankfully, everything else lined up as well, as far as the special effects, the camera work, the stunt work. But then you see this story between Gwen and Peter that really, for me, worked the most when I rewatched this. That's what got my attention, and not so much the villain, which I do have an issue with when we get to the story. But it's kind of neat to see how much our opinions may or may not have changed since the last time we saw it, based on, our tastes, and kind of really looking back at this, knowing where it ends up as far as number 2, and how this on its own may or may not stand as a single story or a single movie. So we were talking about the reveal about Spider-Man, the reveal of Peter Parker, and this reboot itself has a very different take on both Spider-Man and Peter Parker from what we had seen in the Raimi trilogy. So, Bobby, your impressions on how you felt they handled this Peter as a skateboarder, as some people criticized it as not being nerdy enough. Maybe, what are your takes on how they handled this Peter Parker in the reboot?
I enjoyed it. For me, I'm big into the comics on Spider-Man. It's one of my favorites. I know I'm obsessed with Hulk, but I'm obsessed with Hulk for a different reason. Whereas like Spider-Man, I've read the most Spider-Man, and I own the most books for Spider-Man. Naturally, I enjoy Spider-Man movies a little bit more, and I'll critique it more because of the knowledge I have from reading so many Spider-Man books. How this one differs for me from the Raimi trilogy to this one, we're not going to compare ASM to just the first one. Yes, he's portrayed differently, but like I clocked the origin story in this one. It was 54 minutes. At 54 to 55 minutes is when he had the suit on, and you fully see Spider-Man burst, and he's swinging through the city for the first time. That to me, that's a pretty good origin story for a giant chunk of the movie to not have anything really important going on. When for a superhero movie, like, when it comes to what people expect, they want all this flashy action in their superhero like right away, which we've seen with a lot of different movies. Like look at even the Batman movies. Like they escalate the story progression of a birth of a character so quickly, which is understandable because you want to get to the important bits to make that money and make the hero or villain touted, and that's what's important. This movie, they took their time, and I like the direction it took. I don't think it's a bad thing. We've seen different ways Peter Parker's been portrayed throughout the books and different rewrites and different, reorigin stories that they've done over the years. And this one was cool. Like, I don't have a problem with it. Yeah, he wasn't like super klutzy, which that's how Tobey Maguire was portrayed in the Raimi trilogy. But he did have his moments of, being a klutz, and, he stuttered a lot and scared, especially when it got around Gwen. He was very shy and, obviously didn't know how to act around a girl that he liked. The dynamic that you're talking about with the relationship, I like how, she was the same way he was. Like, she wasn't in the Primary trilogy where it was like MJ, he was trying to chase MJ down because, she was with somebody else. Whereas this one, they kind of like detracted towards each other and were both awkward towards each other. But back to Spider-Man, Peter Parker being a skateboarder, that's fine. It's a different take on it. And they incorporated that within how he learned his abilities at the same time, which I thought was pretty neat. Didn't have a problem with that at all. You always see him with the skateboard when he's in school, and it's not that he used it as a weapon, but he had it with him, so it was part of his character design. And you still was nerdy because you see all the the contraptions he had in his room, and how embedded he is in with science because he gets to lured into the science that he discovered with his father and all that stuff. So he's definitely nerdy in that aspect too. So I like the dynamic that they created for him to where it wasn't this klutzy kid that was also awkward and then just gained powers. Like, this kid is obviously super smart, a teenager, but not as goofy as he was portrayed in another version, which to me was fine.
It was definitely a more realistic teenager when I was rewatching it than like the 30-year-old Peter Parker that we saw in the Raimi trilogy. So this was, I think, a more accurate take and a more modern take too on the character. What about you, Millennial Mike?
Yeah, I have to agree with Bobby on some of those things, and I'd like to add some things as well. When it comes, so first I'd like to talk about the portrayal of him as someone who is a nerd, right? So I have heard those same criticisms, and the thing is that I get what people mean when they say the words that they utter, although I don't think that what they're saying actually reflects how they feel. They want to see a character that reflects a kind of an archaic version of Peter Parker that's been kind of vetted already, which is, and this is the case for a lot of Golden Age alter egos. Clark Kent, they're scrawny, they're insecure, they're really klutzy, they're in this sort of theatrical way where it's almost like it's a show. And I think that a lot of people have this idea that in a modern retelling that's supposed to either work or they're going to make it happen so that way they can appease fans who have this very concrete idea. And in my mind, I was able to really get to see the way that this was translated in a natural way. I mean, in 2012, when this movie was created, because technology's advanced. We all have iPhones, technology, comic book movies, pop culture. I mean, we're in a very advanced stage where, the nerd had already won for decades before this movie even came out. The nerd has won. So what a nerd is now isn't what a nerd was then. You're not going purely upon physical strength and ability, and there's other factors. I mean, everyone is doing things that are quote unquote nerd that would be quote unquote nerdy back when the original Spider-Man comics came out. So I really don't buy that criticism, or at least the way that it presents itself, on Twitter or whatnot. Another thing, so the whole skateboarding aspect. So for some reason, this is also not a very shallow argument. Skateboarding makes you cool, therefore nerds don't skateboard, which, that sounds like it comes from a child, but then at the same time, any child would know how actual kids act. So I don't know what that comes from, but, but I think it's really actually great to give him that hobby, mostly because it kind of gives you a precedent for maybe a little bit of like an adrenaline junkie or someone who's comfortable with moving quickly and being in a precarious kind of sport where you're on this. So I think that kind of like the fact that he does that actually justifies, I think, a little bit his willingness to start kind of exploring with his powers as we see as the story goes along. And despite injury or or potential self-harm or danger. So I think that could also be a really great way to do that. And maybe the reason why they added that in, I don't know why they did. In general, I think that the character was portrayed really well. Andrew Garfield has this really great genuineness and authenticity to him that I love. he's really, he has this sort of humor about him. He's skinny, he's lanky, he's got this big like grin, these dimples. He does this really funny head wagging motion when he's excited or he's bashful or whatever. So he's got this really like goofiness to him that I think really worked well. And to top that off, Emma and him, just amazing. I mean, just incredible. That's gone down even back in the day when the movies were being derided by naysayers. That was the one thing that even they couldn't deny. So I think I hit on a lot of things. I probably missed some things, but I don't want to ramble too long. In general, I think his performance was really great. I have no complaints at all. I think it was good stuff.
This is why I like exploring this with, a couple people, because on my watch, I didn't connect the dots of, okay, he's a skateboarder, so that would explain how he's able to, like you mentioned, not be as scared as Peter Parker was in, let's say, the first Raimi trilogy of trying out his powers and really advancing and figuring this stuff out. It brings that spirit of the sport onto this basically another sport, a type of almost like parkour or something that they explore in the movie. So that made a lot of sense too. And the one thing I wanted to touch on as far as the nerd aspect is, I don't know if, we have different life experiences and different age gaps here, but when I look back at high school, the skateboarders were not the cool kids. If anything, they were the outcasts, at least in my high school. And they were the ones who were kind of just off on their own table. They were mixed in with the goths. Usually they were the same people. And so they weren't the popular kids. And that kind of fits in with this type of Spider-Man that they're going with, of he's not necessarily quote unquote nerdy, although I think him being into photography is pretty nerdy. Like, it's like being a band kid. That to me is nerdy, at least in my high school, along with the video game kids and all that, but also was band and photography and yearbook. All that shit was nerdy. And that's kind of what they went with, a more modern type of nerdy, where it's someone who's a photographer and at the same time, he's a little bit of an outcast. He's not unpopular, but he's also not mingling with every single person out there. He's just kind of doing his own thing. And that reflects on that character that they built here of someone who was essentially abandoned by his parents in a way. He has a lot of questions about his past, and that reflects in how he is in school.
I agree with you that the portrayal of the skateboarder, like Mike was saying with the cool kids, but you're saying on the other end of the spectrum with being an outcast. I think that's what they were trying to do, is show him as an outcast, but at the same time, instead of just being this, in his room, like Tobey Maguire was in his room all the time. That's what we saw him in his room all the time doing all sorts of different things. And with this version, we saw him like out doing things. So I took it as, this shows him as out in the corner type person because he's always alone. But the skateboard, and I think it exemplified it when they had the scene where he's testing his powers, when he's doing the kick flips. He wasn't making all his kick flips, so he was missing things. So it's not like the superpowers that he got made him a better skateboarder. Like, he was still missing simple kick flips and ollies while they were showing that scene. I think this is to strengthen his ability to be a little more agile. Like, he wasn't just this lanky, non-athletic dude. Like, he's athletic, but when given the powers that he had, being a skateboarder in that fashion, kind of like a good example is like he's on his way home and he's in that subway in this small fighting scene. The first thing I thought is like, okay, how does he know how to fight all of a sudden? But the thing is, he wasn't really fighting. He was just jumping back and forth, and his reflexes were acting upon him. And that's how he was hitting those people in the subway. And then you look at the scene just shortly after when he's on the skateboard, and it's like, I connected the dots. I was like, okay, well, now they're showing he always held the skateboard. He was on his backpack or he was carrying it. Well, now he's using it. And like the first couple ollies he did, he missed. And then he get a kick flip and kick flip. Can't talk. And he missed. So that's how I portrayed it. And it's similar to what you were saying, like outcast emo in the corner type dude. But I just think that might have been not symbolism, but the connection there to why they gave him the skateboard hobby is because that gives him the agility that we saw with him just knowing how to do things all of a sudden. Because it's not like he just sat around all the time being a lazy geek, if that makes sense. I don't have a better way to say it.
Yeah. And to add to that too, I mean, he is an urban kid. He's not Clark Kent. So that I think also informs kind of hobbies and culture and whatnot that he may pick up. And I don't think he can be like this kind of like, dweeb, buck-toothed dweeb, is always adjusting his glasses and going, breathing, mouth breathing. Like, that's kind of what I think people kind of wanted him to be, while at the same time kind of looking on the outside as though he's a modern kid. I think they did a good job, like most good directors doing adaptations on these kinds of comic book films, quote unquote, deconstructing the film, taking it down to the basic idea of the character, and then rebuilding it in a framework that works for the movie they're aiming at. So, yeah, the whole case, a really great thing too, because there's a bunch of other aspects that you can actually point to that show his social status within the community in which he lives. As opposed to just, he rides a skateboard. Like, all kids in all neighborhoods around the world who ride skateboards are cool and have high sociability. The one thing that was really funny was when it was like one of the first scenes that attractive girl comes up to him and says, "Hey, I really love your pictures. Can you take a picture of my boyfriend's car?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, sure." And then to top it off, he's like, "The usual schedule." He's like, so it went from, "Hey, I'm giving you some tension because I need you to take a picture of my boyfriend's car, and we've done this before." So that immediately, within those few cleverly written sentences, gave you an idea of his relationship with other people within his school. And it shows that, he's not by any means looked at the top of the social totem, if you will.
Right, like he's not seen in that way. The only person that seems to view him that way, it looks to be Gwen. And I love that relationship between the two characters, and I actually can't wait to touch on that when we get to the story. The other persona, Spider-Man himself, this was going to be a tricky one to pull off for him, especially with the success of the last 3 films. And in this case, I don't know if you guys got the same impression, and I do want you to expand on, what you overall thought on Spider-Man and how they handled this one. But the first thing I think of when I was viewing this is that it's a much younger Spider-Man. Like, it really feels like a high school Spider-Man in look and in the way he acts and in his humor. What do you think, Bobby?
Oh, I loved it. I loved every second of it. I wish we got more of it because, like, the jokes and the quips that he had were fantastic. Like, one of my favorite scenes is at the valet parking lot and the guy's trying to break into the car. It was amazing. There wasn't enough scenes in the movie where he was like freely swinging around and able to have those scenes. The next closest we got was like when he was fighting the cops, just a little bit, but not enough. But then I think that would have been overkill, kind of. And then early on, or not, maybe not, in the middle, he took a phone call from his Aunt May while he was on the building top, just to get eggs. That happens like almost in every other book, where Aunt May calls him and it's like something silly, like, "Oh, can you pick up a loaf of bread on your way home?" While he's swinging, and he's like, "Yeah, May, I got it." And she'll make a comment of, "Wow, it's so windy. Are you on the subway or something like that?" And he'll make an excuse and then tell jokes. I mean, we didn't get all that in there, but the conversation with the eggs was a perfect example of what happens in the comic books. And then the valet scene, that's what happens. Like, he's beating up people or having little fights, and he's telling the jokes the whole time. Some of them are ridiculous, some are nothing but puns. And you see it when he's around other heroes in the books. Like, they can't stand when they're fighting with him or teaming up because he doesn't shut up. So I enjoy that. Sometimes it gets a little ridiculous, but that's part of the persona that Spider-Man has in the books. So to see it translated into the movie that way, I enjoyed it. I think it shows his not immaturity, but maturity as a high school teenager, because that's what the role they went with in this film, and being able to have fun with what he was doing for obviously his greater purpose. And that's what I liked about it so much. I don't think he did bad. If I were to compare it to Tobey Maguire, I obviously like this one better, but the 2 different directors and 2 different stories, so much different.
And I also like that the humor didn't undercut like a bunch of scenes. It was all appropriate. It wasn't cringy. It all fit perfectly within the character, within the scene. and within this Spider-Man that they were creating, because he was different enough from his Peter Parker persona when he was Spider-Man. And I think that helps that difference, that alter ego between the two characters. And I think they made that very clear.
It's funny because a lot of people seem to like to split up these characters that have alter egos. And they like to say, this actor did a good job at this, but did a bad job at that. Or a bad job at this and a good job at that. I don't think that is a thing at all with Andrew Garfield's version. I thought he did amazing on both jobs. And I think that his acting actually got to shine in different ways and in the same way and in the same ways in regards to his, masked and unmasked. I loved his expression. He has some great body language. He's he's more expressive as Spider-Man than any Spider-Man we've ever gotten, except maybe a cartoon. The whole, oh my God, my greatest weakness, small knife. Like his whole body is acting. And you get these really great, like as a Spider-Man fan, because of all of the versions of Spider-Man that I've played in games, I've watched in cartoons and seen in movies and read in comic books and everything. This is the reason why I like Spider-Man, because of how animated he is while he's in the suit. Because that's the thing, is Spider-Man is one of the most dynamic characters. I mean, when he's swinging, he's always striking the most dynamic pages. And even when he's expressing himself, he's always his arms are always involved when he's speaking. His eyes are very expressive. They tried to kind of, in later versions, the later version, they tried to use these animatronic eyes to try to replicate that to, a degree of success. But I felt like they still managed to really get they did the same thing. They got the same purpose across in the way that Andrew really performed. I think his voice is really great. I think it's got a certain youthfulness to it without being too annoying. And he has great comedic timing. Toby, it's not just enough to write funny quips for Spider-Man. You have to really be able to time it, the voice fluctuations. I crack up when he's just that whole scene with the carjacker or whatever at night with the knife and all that was just hilarious. And how he's like swinging the webs and like hitting him, on the wall. And then he's kind of walking away, while he's turning his back to the guy, and he whips around and he like shoots him with the web in the mouth or the nuts. And it was just
fun.
He was having so much fun. And I also loved when Gwen asked him, is like, are you afraid of what you can do? He's like, no. At the same time, this was early Peter, and I think that he hasn't yet gotten the opportunity to become afraid, which I think later versions, he gets the fear of his responsibility. And that's one of the other great things about Spider-Man. And the reason why I like Spider-Man so much is because of how much he just gets beat up on. He gets just trampled on. His life gets flipped upside down and is under threat of that all the time, and the amount of stress that he has. In a lot of people will say that he uses his quips as like a coping mechanism. I want to first address that statement on one level. I don't like the way that it's used in the general conversation, because I feel almost as though that kind of argument has spread throughout all comic book characters that use jokes when they're doing their superheroing as the coping mechanism joke, or the coping mechanism trope, I should say. And I don't think that, while a lot of people do that in real life, I think that the way that you choose to make your film and to cast your characters and to have the interplay between your characters is still a creative decision, and can't be solely blamed upon, all these characters joking out of insecurity or as a coping mechanism. I think it's a really cheap argument to use. So while I understand that that's how he actually has been written in the comic books in that way, and that may be the case in this version of Spider-Man, I don't necessarily take it at that level that he uses his humor. I mean, he could be doing it for just because that's who he is, or because he feels strong or powerful in that moment, and that's kind of a way of him expressing his comfortableness with the situation. Obviously, when things get rough, I don't think that he'll be joking as much. And the show is always, and this franchise has always done a really good job. This two movies, the Amazing Spider-Man movies, has always done a really good job with the tone and managing that. So, yeah, I think he did a great job as Spider-Man.
And later on in the story too, like you said, he doesn't really joke around with the lizard in that final fight. It is serious. He turns it on when he needs to, but in that case, you don't really see a lot of it. And to me, I don't know if you guys got the same impression, but there's some ego to this Spider-Man, which I kind of like. He's enjoying his powers. But he also has this other side of him where he's still trying to find this killer to Uncle Ben. So there's this aggressiveness to him. And when he's trying to look for him, never finds him. That's a part of the story that we'll touch on. But because of that, I feel like this is probably one of the darker iterations that we've seen. And they probably won't go this dark again for a while. I haven't seen the new movie, so I don't know if they do. But this version of Spider-Man, as you said, doesn't have that fear. I think I see a little ego there and some aggressiveness. But it fits with that, again, that lonely character, or that guy that was abandoned, or that guy that hasn't really found his way yet. Finds a little bit of light with Gwen Stacy. Did either of you feel that same way?
Yeah, he's bold, and yeah, he's trying to discover some things, but the underlying factor is, he's looking for the killer of Uncle Ben. The thing that matches the books is he's not just trying to get rid of the lizard because the lizard's a threat to the city. He's also trying to save Kurt Connors. They have that relationship in the books. They worked together, and they both know who each other are. It's not like I want to unmask this person because I don't know who he is. Like they know who they are. I liked how they did that. We'll get to the story stuff later, but I do like how they didn't keep that a secret, and they created that dynamic there, because that is true to the books. Like, he's not just trying to stop the lizard as a threat, but he's trying to save Kurt Connors.
If I could interject a bit,
Go.
That's the relationship that Spider-Man in the books usually has with most, if not all, of his rogues gallery. So yeah, to that point, although I would actually say that, and we'll get to this, I think we'll get to this later in the podcast, that one of my criticisms is with, and it's very nitpicky, but it's with the villain, and it's not so much a story-driven point, but more of just a pet peeve about his characterization, and that I didn't feel was necessarily justified. Yeah, but I'm done. Until we get to that point, and then we can talk more about maybe why I didn't like some of the characterization.
Yeah, I think we have the same idea with that. So when we get there,
we can jump into the story. I was going to mention the costume, but that can actually go really well with special effects. So we'll leave that at the end, because there's some conflicting opinions out there on this version of the costume, which they later changed in the sequel. But the story itself, this is where I think all three of us are probably going to have the most issues with the movie. And again, all three of us like the movie, but there is some problems here. It's not a perfect story. It's not a perfect script. And let's talk about the lizard. Let's definitely dive into that, because I think I agree with you guys. It's probably one of the weaker parts of the film, and honestly, one of the weaker villains that we've gotten out of the Spider-Man movies.
The thing that I feel was not justified is the idea that beyond just the serum that he's taking having an adverse effect on his health physically, and it gave him like this kind of obsessive drive to continue, like a drug, that it also created like this second personality, which essentially informed the decision that he made instead of him. Because this is the thing, my complaint with this has zero to do with whether it is accurate or not. I could care less whether it is accurate or not. I mean, sure, maybe I would prefer to see it, or I prefer not to. I'm gonna be honest. The Lizard wasn't my favorite Spider-Man villain. I remember him in the cartoon, and I enjoyed it, but I was not prepared to go into this getting anything. So when they gave this to me, I was fully open and willing to accept whatever that was. And for the most part, it was fine. But my criticisms, and I have to state this very emphatically, have nothing to do with the accuracy. I despise the accuracy related arguments. My criticisms lie in the fact that I think it's kind of weak for a antagonist to be impelled by some third party source or some outside source that is not within his own incentives. Because when the lizard is doing the things that he is doing because it is in his own best interest, the conflict becomes a lot stronger. If he's just being puppeted by some kind of possession, if you will, some kind of spirit, some kind of, thing in his mind, then what he's fighting isn't Kurt. Like Kurt's literally gone when Spider-Man is fighting him. And there's times where when he gets cured, he breaks out of it and he kind of helps Peter or whatever. But it just feels very manipulative. It feels very cheap and very plot devicey. And it also feels like it's trying to serve the people who enjoy that version of Kurt, where he does have this person in his head speaking and telling him what to do. But this is a very grounded take, and I would say that this is probably the least grounded part of it. There's no scientific reason why he would have this second person in his head telling him, you need to turn everyone into lizards. And also, I don't think that and another criticism I could also make is that I don't think that his motivation for turning everyone into lizards, while at the same time it wasn't even his own motivation really, it also is kind of ridiculous, and they didn't even use it to its greatest degree. I think that he could have really been shooting any sort of random plot twist, MacGuff, or plot armor, not armor. What is the word I'm looking for? Plot device, MacGuffin smoke into the air to do some kind of catastrophic thing, and it wouldn't have mattered what it was. So I think in general, it was very weak in that front. Which, a lot of comic book movies have this kind of weak sort of, it doesn't matter, it's just there to move the plot along kind of story. So I'm not being overly critical of it, but this is by no means exempt from that same criticism. So I have to, in good honesty, bring that out.
I don't know if that double personality thing, because I'm not as big of a Spider-Man reader as you are, Bobby, but is that a part of the character in the comics? Is that why you think they went with a double personality? And do you think they could have done something a little bit more interesting or more grounded to what they were doing with the rest of the film?
It is accurate to the books. Like, he does have that alter ego in his head, and it's like mad scientist syndrome, and that's what happens. The problem with me personally, and it's a little different than Mike's, but also the same vein, is the villain doesn't have a proper purpose, and turning people into lizards was a little ridiculous, but I guess that's what they wanted to go with. I wouldn't say it failed, but it gave a reason to what we saw at the end of the story, which is fine for what they told. But my bone to pick with it is there's been different rewrites on how Kurt Connors becomes the lizard, and there's been different iterations of how it goes along. There's ones where he's trying to, he's experimenting so much and his daughter gets turned into one, so he's trying to reverse it, and that's what drives him mad. There's another where obviously he's trying to regenerate his arm, and that's kind of what we got here. The only issue was, if you notice, he didn't want to do human trials, and that was the thing that came up with Norman Osborn, and which we never saw, which is fine. We didn't need him in the movie, but he was working at Oscorp, and Norman Osborn was mentioned. And the guy that shows up threatens him and pretty much says, we need to step this up. Norman wants human trials immediately. He's sick. And Kurt defies him. He's like, no, absolutely not. He's like, all right, well, clean your office out. I'm removing everything. You need to be out by the end of the day. So he fired him from the whole program. So all of a sudden, Kurt, on his way out, injects himself. And it's like, that's the wrong motivation. So he did a human trial on himself because he got fired. To me, that's not the right motivation. The motivation that he had in the book, and I'm not trying to, Mike, I know you said you dislike comic accurate. I'm not trying to defend that. I'm just looking at it the way that my issue with the film itself, which was the quick 360 in attitude from, not doing human trials to where I got fired. Now I'm going to inject myself. That to me did not make sense. Mm-hmm. And yes, that's against the book, or books, I should say. My issue is like the 360 turn, and that to me does not make sense. It's like you weren't willing to do human trials. You got fired, and all of a sudden you want a human trial yourself. So that was a weird part. And then rewatching it, that's why I examined. I'm like, okay, does this write itself? It didn't. And then he ends up in the sewer with his lab that he set up and doing the recordings while he's doing stuff to himself. That's the kind of Kurt Connors we know, and then, obsessed with his work. And then later on you hear him, talking to himself, his personality. That's normal. That's book material. That was all fine. But like what Mike said, I have to line up with the turning other people into lizards. That was a weird motive to have him do.
Interjecting again, but
Oh, you good?
As far as the human trial situation, I do think that's an interesting criticism. I would say, like, if I were trying to think from his perspective why he would not want to do human trials, it would be because he doesn't want to test something on other people. It's more of an altruistic thing, right? And actually, when he said that he wasn't going to do human trials, the person who was threatening him, the Norman Osborn crony, he said that, oh, I'm sure we'll find someone after he fired him. We'll just go to the Veterans Hospital and I'm sure we'll find someone there. And he got really shocked and he was like, oh, aghast, because he's concerned about other people. After he was fired and he feels there's no other way to fix his drug, which he ultimately thinks will help other people, it would be within the altruistic spirit to then turn to himself as a last resort to use the drug to try to perfect it. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a complete 360 from his motives, being that I believe his motives were altruistic. I mean, it could possibly be, but I don't know if I totally buy that. But, I definitely respect it.
Yeah, and you're not wrong, and I'm not going to disagree with you. Like you're right in that. I just think that for him to, and yes, you're right. The Veterans Hospital was mentioned, and he kind of turned his attitude. But to immediately turn around and start testing himself without the motivation to do that on himself, whereas like, and I'm gonna go towards books here. In the books, it was like he was obsessed with trying to get that formula to work, and he was always testing himself. And that's how he eventually became the lizard, because of the genetics, the animal genetics, which Peter was able to convince him of because he found his father's paperwork. So
would the motivation not be, because for me, and I think he was weak, but I don't think it was non-existent, because without his lab, he doesn't have the means to do testing. So therefore he would only have himself, and he does. And his goal is to make this drug work so that way he can improve people's lives. So that seems like motivation. He's like, listen, they took everything from me. I have nothing. So, but I still have my drug. I still have my mind. I still have my research. They can never take that away from me. So what am I going to do now? I have to make this happen. So it was because he got his stuff took away, leaving him with no other option. That's what it would seem to me. It didn't feel like there was no motivation there. Like I'll just stick myself with this needle because whatever. Like, no, he wants to make the drug happen. That didn't just disappear when they took away his lab.
Well, we do have to remember too that he is a world-renowned scientist. Like, he's famous in this version of the movie, of the story. He sees that old picture of his dad and Kurt, and then now of like in the back of books, and he's on TV and all that. Like, he's a big deal in that world. So I think he would have been fine if he got fired. Like, oh well, I'm still this fucking huge name. He could have continued his work. I don't think he was fully without anything.
Which is why I think it's a weak motivation, but not. It's a comic book. This is an element of the story that's niche and small enough to excuse a more radical, action than maybe is warranted. But once again, it's not big enough of a plot for people to care enough. No, I totally get you. It's not like the solid, Diamond Absolutes level writing that, maybe we we could come to expect if we preferred. But, it's definitely weak, but I don't think that it's non-existent. It definitely could be in a bad faith conversation. It could definitely be explained away. And in a open, neutral conversation like we're having, we can definitely see, all the sides of it for sure.
I just think to focus on that one point, I think it just happened too quickly. I guess that's my issue with it.
I agree.
It's just an instant 360, like that one short conversation. It's like 3 minutes of dialogue, I think, or less. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right, I'm going to inject myself, which you explained perfectly. You can't argue with you. You got a good example there of why. There's his purpose. But to switch that fast, and of course he's sacrificing himself. We get that too. I guess the other angle is like, did the director or writer want us to feel sympathetic towards him because he is sympathetic towards Peter. Like, look at the very end. Like, he saves Peter at the end when he starts transforming back after the antidote. So there's not a hate relationship there when it comes to mentor and doctor. It's more of there is a relationship there. And did they try to portray that with Kurt as far as like, okay, well, like you said, like, this is my last shot. I'm just going to go ahead and try this on myself because of the other people are going to get in worse danger.
Yeah, I didn't get enough time to breathe, I think. I think it was so, like, coming from the standpoint of an audience, when you see him inject himself, this comes off hot off the heels of his lab being taken away. And you don't at that moment get the strong impression that the feelings that he is feeling are that of altruism and sacrifice and determination, but rather almost kind of like a loss of, like, a hopelessness, and maybe some anger, some revenge, maybe because of his frustration because of what and then not too long after that happens, he is attacking that guy, after he gets turned into the lizard. And it's not made apparent at that time that he has the alter ego. So it isn't until a little bit later in the story that they clearly, because his first time turning into a lizard, he injects himself, he gets into the cab, they drive off, and then a few scenes later, he's on the bridge attacking, the crony. And then later on, you see him doing like the video testing of himself. And while he's doing that, you hear the third voice, that second voice in his head. As you're watching this and you see these events unfold, you're maybe thinking that the things that he is doing are his own incentive, which puts a negative and not an altruistic light on his actions. So that's a big issue. I think that it's a small issue that's pervasive throughout the entire story, and specifically with the character of the lizard, is that because there's this weird, multi-personality thing going on, the incentives and the goals of the character aren't really defined. And then to top that off, he has this weird, lizard people plot device that's also nonsensical. So his character is just very foggy. He's not a very strong, solidly written character. And it just doesn't really allow him to be defined as well as he could be. I would like to see an altruistic, good-natured scientist who is pushed to a point where he had no other choice, and he's fighting for, like, if he had maybe a daughter who needed curing or something like that, or some other thing that was causing him to butt heads with Spider-Man, that would have offered much more really great conflict, because it's either my daughter or this goal that I have, or saving my own life. Maybe I'm dying of something or whatever. It's either this or the city, or either this or something else. And that would have caused a much better ideological clash there that would have made us become more invested in both Spider-Man and in Kurt Connor's The Lizard.
It's almost as if the movie expected us to, well, he injected himself with that serum, therefore he's now crazy. And that's where this reptile stuff. So, that explains that.
Yeah.
One of the problems I also had with the story is the lack of closure. And I understand that they were building this up to be a franchise. And there's right and wrong ways to do that. I think movies like Batman Begins, you get just enough of okay, he leaves a calling card, like a little bit there to tease you for the next one. But then the story itself wraps up pretty neatly. In this one, there's the story of his dad, which was left completely open. There's also I don't know if it's a metaphor for Uncle Ben's killer of, you'll never find that killer, or if you do, will that really end anything? But they never made that clear. It's almost as if these threads were left we're going to answer these eventually, even with that post-credit scene. He's like, you didn't tell him the truth about his dad. So I don't know, that was the other bit where enough of the story was just left completely open that they established at the beginning, in the very opening scene, he's playing hide and seek with his dad. It's like, that almost was the heart of the film. If you didn't have Gwen and Peter, that would have been it right there. And they just left it completely.
Mm-hmm.
That does stay true to the books, because there's always a mystery. Whenever they try to dive into that story in the books, he still doesn't know clearly what his father was doing. So I think that's why they left it that way, but who knows? Yeah, there was the hide and seek, and then they tried to show a relationship there, and then obviously dumping him off to the aunt and uncle, and then the bag that he found, and then research with Dr. Connors, and then looking into Oscorp and all that stuff. He found that through his dad's bag, and then the formula, and sharing that information with Kurt at his home when he met up with him, like that's what reestablished their relationship, because he had said that he hadn't seen him in all these years. Obviously he was a kid at the time, but that's left all unanswered. And then like you referenced the after credits, like that was another thing, and that's his alter ego talking to him. So there is a mystery there, and if I remember correctly, in the second film it doesn't get resolved either. It's still left open.
Well, that's another character called the Gentleman, is what they call them. That's not his alter ego. So there's another character that is somehow involved with Peter's dad, I guess. It's just thrown in there.
Well, that's in his mind, though. Like, he wasn't actually there.
The whole Peter story, I feel, in a lot of ways, is actually very equivocal to the Codex story in Snyder's, saga. It's because, think about it. So Peter's father put something inside of his DNA that allowed him to inherit the ability to become Spider-Man. Okay. And this would have implications in the future. Not necessarily in the next movie, but perhaps in following sequels that may or may never happen. The Codex in Man of Steel also comes into play a little bit in Justice League because it allows him to be resurrected. Mm-hmm. So I think that, and it was put inside of him by his father to allow that to happen in a later movie. Now, this is the thing. Because of this simple lack of information and us not being all knowing, we will never know if this was planned or if it wasn't. It's always so difficult to rate a movie that's supposed to be a part of a larger story based upon, like, rate a movie and judge it on its conclusiveness or not its conclusiveness. Because, yeah, I mean, we were robbed. This franchise, this series is not going to be concluded. So there's a lot of things that are taken away from this movie because of that. So I don't necessarily take that away from this individual movie. It was doing a great job building up a story, and we just didn't get to see the rest of it. That's it.
Did I miss any message, though, where they do talk about, let's say, Uncle Ben's killer, of, okay, where you're always going to, if you find them, you're always going to find the next Uncle Ben's killer. They're always going to be out there. That's another one too. And I get that maybe that's like a part of the comic in certain iterations, but in this case, he was frantically searching, and then they kind of dropped that story thread as well.
Well, there was an interesting moment when he was at dinner, when he got invited over, and the conversation with Captain Stacy, when he was talking, Peter started arguing with him when the conversation came up. And I think Captain Stacy made a great point. If it was intended that way, or he was, it kind of made sense to me, because Peter was trying to defend the fact that, Spider-Man's he's not a hero. He's just trying to, help the police. And then Captain Stacy fired back by saying, well, what does he know? What if he didn't know that we were tracking that person to find it was a part of a ring? And you could see him, like, when he heard that, like, oh crap, I messed it up. But it quickly tried to defend himself even further. So that aspect there kind of reminded him, like, okay, I'm being selfish with trying to, because he even mentioned that. He said that, like, it's as if this spider guy has a vendetta, and he did, obviously. And then they referenced the arm, and he kind of backed off a little bit, but then still argued the fact that, he's helping. But his tone changed once he said that, when he said, like, we were tracking that person, a part of a ring. It didn't really come up again later, unless you were, the different scenes where he was reminiscing and listening to the phone messages that he had saved on his phone.
I definitely get what Dan is saying, though, because this is kind of a thing I think that happens a lot with pop culture media, especially maybe it's based upon multitudes of other stories. And it's impossible to unknow Spider-Man before you watch the next Spider-Man thing. So it's it's going to be really hard to watch something with complete empty head, like, oh, this is a brand new character, because it's not. And that's and also the movie is going to be made as though these meta narratives about the characters exist, and it's going to be woven into the fabric of its marketing, all the way down to the way that the story is written and directed and created. So that's never going to be taken away. I think this is a tiny little tangent, but even like Zack Snyder's saga, I think actually benefits from the meta narratives in that because of our expectations, he's able to kind of tell a story about heroes and about how we view them because those meta narratives exist, because we are having this relationship with the characters at the same, with comic book characters as a whole, right? At the same time that we're watching this movie about these characters that are discussing the roles of these comic book characters in society, it's like a meta experience that we're having. And that's actually what I think it's coming into play right now. In regards to the story of his father, like with a comic book, you can basically have an entire run of a comic book that never explains this thing about who is the Joker or who is Spider-Man's father, what was he doing or whatever. And you can have the entire run go by and it could be a mystery, but that's okay because maybe the next run will touch on it a little bit more in a different story. And it can always, because the character never dies, the story never ends. It's always existed and always will exist. Right. And that's a big criticism I personally have with comic books, and why I don't think that a good story can ever truly be told within the comic book, industry or within the comic book idea, because it's always going to exist in this world where you can't have anything that's truly conclusive. There is no Spider-Man Bible, and there never will be. But anyway, I'm going really I'm really getting preachy here. But in regard to this father situation, the story gave you the desire to know what was going on and for him to find it out. So I think in that way, it made a promise to its audience. And because it didn't fulfill that promise,
right,
whether it be because it ended before the story was over or because they weren't planning on adding it in, that is unfulfilled potential that this story as a movie and not an adaptation of a comic book did not fulfill. So, I understand where Dan's coming from.
Probably my favorite part of the film still is that relationship between Gwen Stacy and Peter, which I think was smart of them to back away from the MJ relationship and really take this to a whole different purpose and focus, because we know ultimately where her story may lead. And at this point, we don't know that they're going to do that in the next film, but they established these two characters. And I think it really helped that both Andrew and Emma started dating while they were filming the movie, because you can see that there's like so much fucking chemistry between the two actors that you feel that love unfold between the two as you're watching the movie. You see them naturally joke with one another. It almost, as Emma's playing off of Andrew, I'm like, is there a little bit of improv going on here? Because it's just so natural to how they're acting, both after they find out that, she knows he's Spider-Man, and then beforehand when they're just in school talking in the hallways. And it was just, I think, to me, the strongest part of the film. That's the part I enjoyed the most in this whole story.
Yeah, the relationship was great. And, right from the start, I particularly enjoy that he didn't have to chase after her, where they kind of both liked each other and were, clumsy about it. That was great. There's different takes on that, obviously, where, in the Raimi version, he had to chase after MJ and then eventually got her attention. But I enjoyed this from start to finish as far as their relationship. I also forgot how the end wrapped up. I thought he was going to keep the secret of why he stayed away from her. But, her turning around and saying, he made you promise, didn't he? He didn't acknowledge it, but she knew it. And I thought that was great, because that to me would have frustrated me if that was left a secret as to why he backed away. And the fact that they let that be acknowledged, at least there's not like this hidden secret of, him backing off and her going nuts as to why he backed off. So I thought that was fine. And obviously they have an interaction later on that kind of lets you know that they're going to be fine.
I don't have as much to say about the relationship between them. I think it's simple as it's just chemistry. There's not a lot of I mean, maybe you can go into the weeds and talk about like how the narrative exemplified certain aspects of the relationship, but I think that you have two top tier actors that are also have, a legitimate relationship, and it just everything came together to make an amazing performance. I think that's what it really comes down to. One thing I will say though, that's kind of interesting is that she said that, I forgot when exactly it was. I think it was when Peter came back hurt and he's sitting on the couch and they're talking and Gwen's like, I've seen this before. My father goes away, he puts a gun on his hip and a badge, and I don't know if he'll come back. I think that the way that they kind of matched those Spider-Man with her father up is really interesting, because it's like, okay, in reality, oftentimes you'll find attractive certain features in a potential partner that your parents display, a certain level of bravery and looking out for, they're similar in that way. So Emma is both fearful of that element of Peter and his relationship with his city and with, the community, but also she admires that perhaps because she also sees that same element in her father. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing that adds to the romance. Also, the amount of foreshadowing that they do. I feel like we're beyond the point where we can talk about spoilers, I think it's okay. But when he threw her out of the school window, that was kind of funny foreshadowing. Well, I mean, very dark humor.
Yeah.
And then also when they're talking in the balcony on their first date, well, kind of when he's over at Gwen's home, after he takes off, I think it's the mother comes up and says, hey, you need to come back. And she's heading in, and then he leaves. She turns around. I forgot, something came up about Spider-Man because like he had to leave for something urgent or whatnot. And she turns around and says, I'm in trouble.
Yes. I got chills during that scene.
When she said, I'm in trouble, because I was like, oh, yeah. At that moment, when I first watched the movie and I heard that, I was like, oh. I was like, oh, snap.
Yeah. Yeah, I got the exact same feeling. Like, this is like, it's meant to be humorous, but if you know, you know.
Yeah. No, they actually played around with the threat that Emma was in humorous ways multiple times, always in humorous ways throughout this movie, only to be repaid in the most severe, one of the most pin drop, shockingly, disgustingly, morbidly sober scenes I've ever experienced in the theater, actually.
No, I'm glad you touched on the relationship too between Captain Stacy and Peter, because that's something they would have never explored had they gone with MJ. And who knows when else they would have gone with that as far as Gwen Stacy. Maybe if you read the original comics where they were dating, you might get a little bit of that. But to see it on the big screen, it's probably the only time they're ever going to do that comparison, to be honest with you. I don't think they'll ever do another Gwen Stacy relationship first and then MJ. It seems like the pattern's still going to be, well, people expect a Mary Jane. So even in the sequel, they set up a Mary Jane that they eventually cut out of the film. So I thought that was great that they did establish that at least a little bit in this version of the movie. Was there anything else in the story that you wanted to touch on before we move on to action or special effects?
Yeah, I got one. My critique, and this is going to be more comic pointed, it was an interesting way for them to tell this story of an origin or a lead off with a retelling of, Spider-Man without incorporating his main hobby, which is photography. They kind of touched on it slightly, obviously, with the joke in the beginning, with the girl that was asking about her boyfriend's car. And he had a camera, obviously. And then you see it again with him trying to take pictures of the lizard when he was in the sewer, when he first sets up that. It wasn't a trap, but he was just trying to figure out where he was. And then that's how the lizard figured out that Spider-Man was Peter Parker, because his name was on the camera.
Yeah, that was silly.
Yeah, it was weird how they did that, but I get it. It's just, they always know who each other are, so that was just their way of dropping it in there. So he's taking pictures of the lizard, but the way he did it, as if he was working for the Bugle, and he wasn't. So my main complaint is they didn't, in this story at all, You see the Daily Bugle once, and it's a newspaper that they show looking for the lizard, like a wanted poster on the front page. So we get no Daily Bugle, we get no Jonah Jameson, which is fine. Just different way to tell this story. But the usual trope is, goofy kid, science nerd, and photography, and he gets the job. He has no money, and he's working for the Bugle, and obviously the yelling guy, which is J. Jonah Jameson. Instead, we got the Captain Stacy was that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Foil. The was kind of his foil in a way, because he was he was kind of leaning towards like Spider-Man's a menace, but not saying that. And obviously that gets resolved later on when he understands why not why, but that he is actually trying to help. And I think he came to the grips with that because of his daughter, and obviously meeting him prior. If he had never met him prior, then obviously it'd be a different story. But that's my main complaint with the story is like, and it's a very light complaint, because telling a story differently than what it is in the books is fine. Like I enjoyed this the way it was. That's what I'm trying to say. But knowing what we know, and obviously from the Raimi titles, it's like there's no Daily Bugle at all. And that was an interesting take. I'm still trying to figure out who the girl, and maybe it is resolved, the girl at the school. If you remember in the gym when the paint bucket gets tipped over, he ends up, messing around with Flash with the basketball. The girl with I think she's got like pigtails. I'm trying to figure out if that's Betty Brant, because it kind of seems like it, but they never mention her name. I mean, you see her twice, I think. You see her in that scene, and then earlier in the film when they're in the courtyard fight, that Flash was bullying the kid with this food, and she was in the background there by the stereo. Again, like they're leaning towards incorporating Daily Bugle stuff, but they didn't, because obviously she had worked at the Bugle, and there's a whole different line of enemies that come from that. But things maybe we would have seen if they continued this story, like they would have developed that character later on. Who knows? But that's my main thing. And then the other would be Flash. They introduced him and they showed him several times. It was the early foil to Peter, and how he got bullied slightly. And then at the end where they wrapped it up, and it's like, well, not wrapped it up, but like all of a sudden he's friendly towards him, like they're friends. Well, they didn't explore that at all. Like,
well, I don't know if they kind of relate to each other because of the loss, right? Because he tells him it feels good.
That's what I thought too. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one thing, but like they don't really resolve, because he was picking on him all the time, obviously, and he embarrassed him at the end. And the loss. But then at the very end, he's like, he's trying to be buddy, and he's got the Spider-Man shirt on, and it's like,
oh,
it's missing. That part's missing as to why Flash is so friendly towards him all of a sudden.
Yeah, I agree with you in that. I think like the science behind how they came to that conclusion could be better. I don't think it works mathematically, but I felt like it worked because of a few different reasons, and I'll explain those reasons. Also, I want to touch upon his proclivity to, photography and all that, and comic book accuracy and some of that stuff too. But since you brought the stuff up last, I'll touch on that first. I think that Flash is he's very superficial from the standpoint of being a bully. And I think that when he stood up for himself, that was a big part that earned his respect. I think that Flash just respects strength. I think that's basically what it comes down to. When he said that he likes Spider-Man because he gets all the chicks, that might be as simple as it is. He likes Spider-Man because he's strong and people like him, and he just immediately respects that. Andrew, before, he would stand up to him, but he was still able to be pushed around and kind of kept under his boot. But when he said, no, you're not going to do that to me, and he showed it with physical strength, there was a certain degree of respect. And then you also have the relatability aspect of the fact that he lost Uncle Ben. So I think that while maybe that could have been developed more, I think that in a story that had enough problems developing other parts of the story, namely perhaps a photography hobby that went beyond what we saw, more of Kurt Connors, that had to be the thing that got cut. That definitely seems reasonable. And then to briefly touch on the photography situation, I think that, being that he is in school and his main hobby and main passion seems to be science, or with a hobby photography just for the school paper, I think that was very appropriate. And that maybe perhaps as a first job, after graduation, more of a photography focused Peter would be appropriate in that situation, always looking for a job and whatnot. I like the fact, though, that this version of Peter Parker was a lot more focused on his tinkering and his science, especially be it that he is in a relationship with Gwen, who's also a scientist. It would make sense that they could relate in that aspect to each other. I think that they simply sacrifice that, not completely, because once again, they could always naturally move into that in the future if they had the opportunity.
So where do you stand on the webs? Are you, because I support web shooters, whereas this is controversial with this film where the first trilogy was flesh shooters, if that's what you want to call it.
I've got your flesh shooter right here.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so that's another great question. The thing about the web shooters is they serve so many utilities. And despite being comic accurate, because once again, I despise that argument. I despise it. Because listen, I love the comics. I love Spider-Man. He's my favorite superhero. And I have an affinity toward his character. So it has nothing to do with the fact that I don't appreciate and love the thing. Most iterations of Spider-Man, there's some I don't like, but the utility that the web shooters serve are several things. So one, it allows him to be easily crippled. A villain or a circumstance or situation, he's inside of water, his web shooters can break, or they can just get wear down, or he can upgrade them, or it allows for a lot of natural conflict and storytelling options that rely upon his intellect, which is also a big part of this story, which I appreciated above all Spider-Man stories that we've seen in the theater. Another thing that it offers, well, actually, I think I kind of tied most of everything into it. He can run out of web shooting, he can be broken. It has to do with his intellect. And also, another thing, it's being that this is a more grounded version of the story, the fact that it's also a device that he created further plays into that too. So I think that it works on pretty much every single level. And then to top it off, if you insist, it was always how it was in the comic books as well. So it's pretty much, it's perfect in every level, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the lizard in this movie even destroyed one of them while they were fighting at the end. So that it shows a more human side of, like, he's not fully superpowered mutant, if that's the word you want to use, because he's not. And I hate that argument too. I despise that argument when there's comparisons on web shooters versus coming out of his skin. Like, it's so. I didn't hate the Raimi trilogy for that, but I thought it was a little weird. And then when we got to these films, I thought that was really cool how they went to the web shooters, and you knew they were going to do it early because when you started exploring Oscorp, they showed those cartridges. So when I saw that, I was like, okay, cool. It looks like we might get the cartridges, but I wasn't sure because, they were using that in that lab there for the webs. So, that just could have been something else. But when they did incorporate it, and then, he was tinkering with it in his room and trying to make it, what did he use? He took apart a watch to make them. And I was like, this is really cool. This is as comic accurate as you can get without complaining about it. And it was like, that's fine. And then, like you said, the argument that goes on and on about this, like even when the new trilogy came out, Homecoming, like, there's this whole debacle, like, oh my God, are they going to go with out of the skin again? Or are we going to get web shooters? Like, why is that? Who cares? Like, yeah, it sucks if it's not what you want, but I agree with you. It's a dumb argument.
Yeah, it's not even one I focused on much when I was watching. I'm like, okay, cool. He's making the things, but I'm also not as big of a Spider-Man fan as either of you guys. So I was just kind of like, well, we need him to swing around, and this is how he gets there. And I thought it was a neat effect, which this is actually a perfect way to go into the special effects, where you see him when he's thwipping, you see like the red light on his wrists every single time when he's doing it. And you get that cool effect, like that cool sound. So it's just an extra thing to his costume too, where they're like, oh, and his wrists are going to light up a little bit too every time he uses them. And that kind of goes with the costume too. When they first revealed it, there was, I don't know if you guys remember, but they were saying how there was too much blue on it and it was way different than the comic iteration. And they might have taken that to heart because in the sequel, they end up going with like an exact comic accurate version of Spider-Man with the white eyes and everything, no longer the tinted yellow from the sunglasses. And so what were your thoughts on the special effects as far as the look of Spider-Man and how the costume worked when they were filming it?
So my take's going to be different on this because Spider-Man has probably the more costumes than anyone else. And I think he beats out Iron Man for costumes. And because of that, I don't give a shit what he's wearing and how it looks because he's got so many different outfits in iterations, in versions, in tech upgrades, and different reasons why he wears different suits. If you're looking from part 1 to part 2 and there's differences, then that's good. That means he improved his costume or, his outfit. Obviously, from what we see in the movie, he handmade it. Like you see him sewing. The first iteration was it was like a onesie suit that you. What am I comparing it to? Always Sunny in Philadelphia, the Green Man outfit. That looked like what he was wearing, but it was red. And then when he fell into that building, which was the luchador ring, that's where he got inspiration to make a better uniform or outfit, whatever you want to call it. And he took, what was it, sunglasses where he cracked the lenses out of, and that's what he used on the mask. So from what they showed us and how they showed it to us, I don't care. It's fine. As far as like different scenes and how it looked, like there were some scenes where it didn't look as fine and tuned, and then later on you see it and it looks very rubbery and more like a thicker outfit. I don't care. They didn't show how he made it or what materials he gathered to do it, except for like the eye lenses. So I don't have too much of a complaint with it because in my mind, I know there's so many different iterations of his costume. It doesn't matter to me. When you compare it to like a Wolverine, when it's one or two things that he wears, maybe three. What's another good one? The Hulk. There's another example. He just wears purple shorts. So my personal opinion, it doesn't matter how many times I want to change the costume. To me, I'm thinking, okay, well, there's a reason because it's an upgrade, or it's, he designed his outfit a different reason because he had an altercation with bullets. So now he used a different material or, something like that. Or, he's up against Kraven. So he's got it designed to, not take as much damage from a spear hit, something like that.
So once again, whenever you hear criticism from me, it's always going to be from the narrative standpoint first, utility within the script and what it does. But I think that the costume, first and foremost, to have any argument about a costume other than it looks nice to the eyes is silly. Because at the end of the day, the costume is there just to represent the character within the story that you're watching. So if it does a good job with that and it looks like it fits, it doesn't stand out and it makes the character look cool while also being believable, if you can hit that middle ground there, that balance, then you got a good costume. The costume, if you look at it in detail, it does have the sunglasses for the eyes. There's still, even in the final iteration, those sunglasses are still actually integrated into the final version. Also, his shoes are straight up Nike shoes. They're kind of integrated into the suit. They have tread on them and everything. So even though the overall suit has a lot of polish, it still insinuates that maybe he somehow created this with his, intellect and the things that he could possibly find. It insinuates that. Probably not, but it insinuates it, and it's good enough to justify the suit. So that's my narrative argument. And then the other argument I could make that I don't like to make, but it kind of just wraps everything up, is that there is a precedent within film that a comic book costume will change for whatever reason. It probably shouldn't. Even narratively speaking, I guess if they tear it up, they could patch it up, or if they can make a new one, depending on the narrative of the story. But consistency is king. If you can make a suit that works, then keep making it. Make it reproducible. So when it tears, you can just make another one. You don't have to go back to the drawing board. Imagine you're a busy superhero going out every night, and you have to constantly recreate, your suit and add and change it completely and the way it looks and everything. It's probably not terribly convenient and terribly practical. But anyway, the second argument I was making is that we all expect it to change. So if this looks like a early suit and it looks good and it looks functional and it's utilitarian, so there's no real complaints to have toward it, and you know that it's probably going to change, then I don't really get why there's such a big deal about it. Like, people act like it's going to be like this way forever. You know, it could be terrible in the next one, which I don't actually. I like the second one better.
I do like the spider design though. Like, a lot of people had issues with it because it strays away from that classic smaller spider. I actually was very excited when I saw that unveiled, that he has that long legs and thin frame of a spider down the whole uniform. I thought it was great. I enjoyed it. And I know why people hate it, but that's because they got a hard on for the original frame of what that suit should be. And you make a great argument. It's not about what it's supposed to be. It's just a uniform. If it's protecting him and he's concealing his identity, then that's all that matters. And for him, especially, like I said, it always changes. So it is what it is.
I like this version of the suit a lot, and I'd have to go back and see the sequel because to really get a look at, all right, well, how does that fit as far as where the story goes? But in this one, a more grounded Spider-Man that we've gotten, obviously they're going for a darker take on the character too. I think the costume very well reflected that. And it looked good too when they were using it for stunt work. And that's something that the director was very keen on, where he wanted to do as much practical effects as they could. And that's actually one of the things with the trivia here. A creative decision by the filmmakers to have most of the stunts performed practically on rigs by actors and stuntmen rather than extensive CGI animation. So the action sequences that we did see, were there any points that you guys noticed, oh shit, that's not CG, that's actually them on wires or actually jumping around or climbing on walls?
It all looked fine. I didn't think anything looked over. There was one spot where he was jumping over a building, chasing the guys in the alley. That looked a little weird, the way he jumped. But other than that, I think everything looked to me practical and nothing weird. They did have some shots at night where he was swinging, where the slower frame that looked really cool, and I like how they did that. You know, the classic Spider-Man poses while he's swinging. They were great. I love those scenes where he's like in a stylization of Spider-Man that you see in the books. It's
like a McFarlane page.
It's great. Loved every single one of them. His swinging animations were great. It also, I don't know if both of you have played the Spider-Man game for PlayStation 4.
I have, yeah.
Okay. A lot of that is reminiscent of that game because he does the slingshot several times, and that's exactly how you do it in that game. Not only that, the shoes you mentioned, Mike, are exactly how they are for that suit for that game as well. So I'm wondering, because this is a Sony production, if this movie led into the design that they used for the game and some of the animations, because swinging through the city is kind of like what you saw in that movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure there was some corporate verticality involved. But yeah, so as far as the action is concerned, this is not a terribly action heavy movie. I think the action is appropriate when it's present, and I think it's pretty grounded. This Spider-Man is almost not even quote unquote Spider-Man. If he's more Batman from the standpoint of the way that they're more consistently portrayed in other bits of media. And the reason why I say that is because it spends more time at night, of course. It's more grounded, it's more practical in most respects. And they don't focus on the fantastical elements of his abilities as much. So and this argument that I'm making isn't so much about its comic bookiness, quote unquote, but more about the fact that they don't focus on his superhuman strength and speed as much. In fact, if he was portrayed as he was in Amazing Spider-Man 2, as he was portrayed that way in this movie, he would have annihilated Lizard. And Spider-Man, of course, you could explain it away as in the way you could explain this away by saying that he's grown or that he's learned his abilities between this movie and another movie. I don't like that argument you can make it if you want to. I think they simply just wanted to tell a different kind of story and focus on different elements of the story. And it's within the plausible deniability. It's within your ability, to grasp. So they just let it happen. I think that's the reason why it actually happened. In regards, let me kind of zone back in on the action, and the effects, I guess. I liked when they were in the sewer. He was in the sewer and he shot the webs down all of the sewer,
Tunnels or whatever.
tunnels.
Pipes.
And that was a really great scene. I love the scene where he was whipping all the cars with the webs and then like sticking it to the side of the bridge. They were all dangling like flies from the side of the bridge. A lot of allusions to an actual spider that's both kind of ironic and slightly humorous, while mostly being cool, and it looks great on camera. They never played it for laughs, but it's kind of like it has a hint of cleverness in there. So it kind of is a little bit of lightness, a little humor, to it, but it's also it completely makes sense, and they don't ever allow it to not be grounded or not make sense within the story that they're telling. So I like that too.
The sewer one was great because I'm glad you brought that up. That ties back to an earlier statement where he asked Connors about how to track a reptile, and his response was they're an apex essentially. Like you can't track, they track prey. But what did he do? Spider-Man, he went into the sewer to track Connors by putting up a web system that spiders use to get their prey, which in his sense, he was trying to lure out the lizard, or find the lizard, I should say. So he used it in reverse order, which I thought was like what you're saying, very clever and funny without making it seem that way. You have to really think about it. And that's how I perceived it.
Clever is a great word. Clever. It's got a hint of lightness in there, but there's more practicality in there than there is ironicness or humor. Yeah. I like that word. Good word.
Yeah. And then you mentioned the cars hanging off the building. They were like, that's how a spider strings up their prey, but obviously the cars weren't prey. He was trying to save people. One important story bit, I know we're on effects. We kind of didn't go over this. The car scene with the kid, Jack.
That was amazing.
Fact that was so cool. And I thought that was a really good way for them to show, hey, I'm not doing this as I'm trying to find Uncle Ben's killer. This is like, I'm actually a hero and this is my moment. The fact that he took off his mask, gave it to the kid, said, hey, put this on. It's going to give you superpowers. You'll be strong enough to come towards me. That was a touching moment. And then obviously tying it back with the father that remembered who he was. Obviously he named himself that moment. We said, who are you? And he said, I'm Spider-Man. Later on with the crane scene, that father comes back and it's like, hey, that Spider-Man saved my son. Let's go. We got to help him, which we can get into later because we're on effects. But I thought that was a weird plot point, but argument for later.
That was like the New York moment. Look at that. They have to have.
Yeah, it was that happened in a very strange way, but I get it. Back to the car. So I just thought that was a very strong moment of you learning his powers the way he did. I mean, even right before that, was it right before it or right after? I can't remember. He was swinging around, screaming and yelling like woohoo, woohoo under the bridge, which I think was before that, or maybe it was after. And to have that strong character moment of being a hero for that kid, which was great.
I want to kind of touch on that too, although I know we're going to be talking about this movie forever, but.
So this is part 1 of our 2-part series on retrospective for Amazing Spider-Man.
Amazing Spider-Man 1. And then we'll have 1 and 2 for
we got to have another one for part 2, which another 2 parts.
2-part, yeah.
But no, it's funny because when you're talking about comic book heroes, there's always this expectation that they're going to have their hero moment, right? And listen, I get it. I'm very cynical about these things because I just am. But having that said, let's just say that it's taken for granted that all these heroes have to have their hero moment where they save a child, or this thing's about to fall on somebody and they get under there and they lift the rubble, whatever. At that point, what's going to save that scene is the acting, pretty much, and the way that it's framed and written, have the context, because there's a fine line where when the saving of the heroism isn't implicit. Like if you're like saving the universe and you have to just destroy this thing or beat this guy and then the universe is saved, then all the people and their lives and their livelihood and their happiness is all just implicit. But when it's something like this, you run the risk of it being like, oh, I'm just saving you to make myself look good. Although it's not clear, but it's like sometimes you can see the inner workings of the story and you know that, oh, here's the hero moment. Here it comes. This is when he does something heroic and he looks great and virtuous. But Andrew Garfield's acting is just so good. His genuineness and authenticity shines through. There's a certain urgency to it where he's like, listen, I'm not going to just like, yeah, I'm being nice to you and I'm trying to be personable, but I'm also trying to be extremely urgent because I know something that you don't, and that is you're going to die in like 2 seconds.
And he comically also says, like, if you could do a little faster.
Yeah, exactly. So it didn't feel, and because of all these things coming together, the way that it was written, the urgency, the undertone of seriousness behind the scene, as well as Andrew's acting, and just the overall tone of the film, all coming together to create that moment, it didn't feel like it was forced or contrived. So I think that they did an amazing job of that as well.
They also, I don't know if you guys got the same sense of this when you were watching it, but when he saves the kid and like he breathes this sigh of relief, like part of me thought, what if that kid had died and this had been his first experience on that? Oof. It would have taken him down a completely different path. He would not have believed in himself as he does, let's say, when he saves the next person. And I think like they made that really important of, okay, this is like a huge character growth moment for him because it could have easily gone the opposite direction here.
Oh, for sure. That was the defining moment. And they could have easily replaced that scene with him trying to save Gwen, which is a usual trope where you save your girlfriend, or MJ in other instances. Yeah. So I'm glad they didn't choose that. And I'm glad that they chose a random, person, which actually came back in later on, which was another good callback.
Well, he's done it. So I like it because that's the whole point. Like, and I think they actually went back. They've gone back to the whole Gwen situation in the comics several times to where he saved someone falling down where he's stationary, right? And he thinks about it. So it'll be they haven't hit terminal velocity yet, so I can do it, or I'll wrap them in webbing, or I'll improvise, right, to find a different way so that way they don't hurt themselves, or I don't hurt them, or no one gets hurt, or I'll jump down and meet their speed while I grab them, so we both fall at the same speed, things like that. So this actually adds justification for for later, and also, I mean, tragically in the second movie, I love the fact that they kind of reference that his webs have a degree of elasticity, as they would have to be that strong, right? Scientifically speaking. And the elasticity is actually what in my opinion, I think it's brutally obvious. Although I think people who are really anchored into the comics, they don't want to see anything else, will believe that it was, a neck breaker or whatever, when it was clearly an impact. But the elasticity came into play there, which I think ended up being fatal for Gwen. But this scene, the scene in the school when he knocks Gwen out the window and does it really quickly, he's done this several times. So why would this time be any different? But it's that one miscalculation and his lack of speed or whatever that caused the events to unfold in the way that they did. So I think it all plays together. I think they do a really good job with that.
Just to round things out, as far as some trivia that we have, I know we touched on Emma Stone already and Andrew and some of the creative decisions here. One of the things Andrew Garfield did during his break in between filming is he went around New York playing basketball with kids in his Spider-Man costume. So that just kind of shows how excited he probably was to, like, some of these actors would be like, I don't even want to deal with that right now, of everyone asking me, you probably couldn't do that today. Everyone asking you, okay, well, who's going to appear in the new Marvel movie? Who else is going to show up? It's just him playing games and having fun as the character. And it just shows how much he really was, he cared for the role and how happy he was to be Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. And the other bit too is this is the first live action Spider-Man movie where the main villain ends up in prison rather than dead or on the run like Sandman does. So, and I'm like, holy shit, that's true. They kill the shit out of some of those villains in the first three movies.
Yeah.
As we round out this retrospective overall, now that we've kind of dissected it, discussed a lot of the aspects, some of the things that worked and some of the things that maybe did not, How would you say, let's say to someone who would be a fan of all of these movies and maybe hasn't gone back and revisited The Amazing Spider-Man, some of the things that they might be able to pull back when comparing it to some of the other Spider-Man that we're now seeing on the big screen, and then the ones we grew up with, like the Raimi trilogy. So go ahead and close us out.
I would say don't gloss this over just because it got two parts. And I know we didn't talk too much about the second part. You know, like Mike and I said, we're going to do this another time. But no, all kidding aside, this movie is really good. Overall, it's my favorite. That's hard. I know some people may be listening to this and like, how dare you say that about Spider-Man 1 or 2 in the Raimi trilogy? I get it. I understand where you're coming from, and I can't argue on that because those films are great too, and for very good different reasons. I think I like this one more because of the story. You know, like I mentioned earlier, it took 54 minutes to get to Spider-Man being Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man. And I liked and enjoyed and was attached to the story leading up to that. I thought the dynamic with Uncle Ben, Martin Sheen did an excellent job playing Uncle Ben. The type of father figure that he took over was really, really cool. Versus the Raimi version, it was very, very short-lived, and it happened a different way. I like how the Uncle Ben scene took in this film for how he died and how it happened. I thought that was really, really well thought out on how they did that, because they were literally right near each other when it happened. And you see Peter's frustration and how he felt guilty because he knows what led up to that, the argument that happened just before it. That's why this one stands out. I also enjoy the costume, and there's people hating on me already because they love the Raimi costume. Fine. Or you know what? Maybe you like the Holland costume. Fine. You can. You're allowed to. But I thought this version, this telling as a comic book fan, I really, really enjoyed it. And that's with me not picking it apart, being a stand for comics. Like I kind of stand back and give my point of view as this is my opinion only, and I'm not anchored to a book. You know, Mike, you made a very good example of that. And I'm not one of those, but I do keep it in mind because I'm aware of, how those are. But this is just a movie. It's just one telling of how that story shapes out. Like, we've seen so many iterations of different characters. Batman's a perfect example. How many times have we seen that origin, and it's different every time we see it? But that's just a director or writer's way of showing it to you. That's all. And I thought that this telling was very well done. My one issue with that story, talking about Uncle Ben, is, Aunt May, even though it was a very good actor in Sally Field, I don't think it was utilized correctly, but that's fine. And I think it's kind of implied at the end where she already knew what he was up to and what he was doing, but they never implied that because she stopped asking why he was hurt when he was coming home. But to say, like, this is my favorite film of all, 6, this is 8 films. So out of the 8 films, this is my favorite one.
Does this include Into the Spider-Verse, the animated one?
I'm not including that one because it's animated. I did enjoy that one. That was a very good film, but it's animated. I know there's voice actors, obviously, and the animation is amazing. It's phenomenal. But from an animated versus real shot film, I'd have to lean towards this one.
Gotcha. Well, that's pretty surprising. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Amazing Spider-Man series. I recognize the issues, the narrative issues with the second one. Mostly, I wouldn't say narrative issues, more pacing issues, I would say, which is part of the narrative. Although I do prefer that. That's my favorite one, mostly because I think that I like Zimmer's music, and I like I love the nighttime shots, the moonlit shots in this. I like the daytime shots, the liveliness, his relationship with civil servants like the fire department and the police, which he kind of fosters in this movie. The whole franchise, the whole this Amazing Spider-Man series works really well together, even despite the differing tones, the different some of the different artistic choices that they make, whether you could justify them or not. And like I said, I could give criticisms for both. This movie, I would say, for anyone who's maybe passed it up or even has said nay about it in the past, I would just say that it's come and it's gone. It can't hurt you anymore. So so because of that, now is the time to give it an honest try. And we've seen this happen with other movies that they're not in competition with anything anymore. So now you can just go back and you don't have to look at it defensively. I think
Right.
that there's so many great things about this film, just from a purely technical standpoint, that will only live on. They will only be appreciated in retrospect, because there's so many great moments and the acting and the music. And when you're watching this film and you don't know or remember what the culture was or the time that it was made or what was going on behind the scenes or whatever, you could just appreciate it for what it is. And I think that there's more than enough here for people to do that. So I definitely think that, and I think people are going back and watching it. Ironically, which, I'm going to try not to be a snarky William Mike like I am in some other episodes, but if they're going back and watch it, power to them. That's good for whatever reason that may be.
Sure. And yeah, I think there were definitely a lot of politics at work when the first and the second one came out, because they knew that if this did not do well, there might be a shot at the character appearing in the MCU. And now that that's no longer, that series no longer exists as far as 1 and 2, there's no third one coming, not one that they announced, or at least any danger of, well, if the second one's a success, then we'll never see him in the MCU. As you said, there are people that are going back and watching it without those notions and kind of realizing that, it is a good movie and it is a good start to this franchise, and it was a great Spider-Man. And Bobby, you were talking about how it's your favorite Spider-Man movie. I mean, I would, if I'm not counting Into the Spider-Verse, because that one is my favorite one, but if we're just talking live action, it'd be tough for me to pick between the first Raimi Spider-Man and this one. I was not one of those that really liked number 2. I know people consider that still one of the best superhero movies of all time. It just never caught me, and maybe I didn't see it enough times. But 1, I have fond memories of. I've rewatched it recently, and it's got this charm to it. But this one is kind of takes it to a whole nother level. And without 1, you couldn't have this one. So I don't put any fault at the Raimi trilogy, because it was doing things that superhero movies were not doing at that time. But because of that, this one could do some things that were more Nolan-esque, that were more grounded. And I think that's probably why I was a fan of this iteration of the character, as opposed to what they tried to do in Homecoming, which was the only version I saw aside from that appearance in Civil War and some of the other movies. So I really like this character. I like this take. It makes me want to see number 2, but also not rewatch it, because I know there's not going to be a third one. And it does end on such a low. So it's like, oh man, we don't get anything else. And we don't see like that bounce back of the character really, aside from like, he's going to fight Rhino and here's this little kid. So it's like this bittersweet type of feeling that I get for this franchise. But at the very least, I can see and appreciate number 1. I like the direction that they were going in. And I think, as you said, that they are going to, it's a movie that's going to be more respected and appreciated as time goes on, and as more people, more growing generations go back and revisit these old movies. I think this one's going to be one that's definitely going to be shining in the history of Spider-Man films. And guys, I do want to thank you both again for volunteering to help with the retrospective, both being people who are big Spider-Man fans and enjoyed the movies themselves also, and also for being a part of the Patreon and for helping vote on the retrospective as well. Without these guys, you wouldn't have this retrospective episode that you are enjoying this a month ahead of everyone else if you're on Patreon, and otherwise you're enjoying this as it releases publicly. Bobby, thank you very much, and please let them know where they can find you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me to do this, and it was great to talk with you, Mike. This was fun. I like battling knowledge. I guess it would have been different if you weren't so much a Spider-Man fan. That would have been interesting to see, but the fact that you were, it's good to see where we stand on most things. And I think we pretty much align on everything. We're not super comic book stands to where we want to sit there and argue, well, it's not comic book accurate.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
not
the
like
worst.
that. Yeah, I'm not like that. I mean, I am personally in my head, but not my opinion. My opinion is my opinion, and I'm okay with it. It's not like I'm just going to stand and fight with it. But anyhow,
Good faith.
yeah. I take it in a good way to not be combative, because that's not how you should argue it. Like, well, that's my opinion, but I get where people come from, and I see why people want to stand by their flag, which is totally fine. But you can find me on Discord, our Discord. The link should be available. Check it out. We talk a lot about comics, movies, daily events and stuff. Mike specifically gets into very unique arguments, which is always fun. I love those arguments. So if you want to be part of those, I call them arguments, but they're just fun opinions that we battle back and forth on. It's great. Join our Discord, hang out on our Discord. That's where you can find me. I'm on Twitter, but for the past 2 years or so, maybe 3, I've just been in lurk mode. I just hang out. I read stuff. If you tag me, I'll respond. Every so often I'll post something, but I just try to stay off of it. It's a little too toxic on there. But you can find me on Twitter. It's at CubanSlim, QBANSLIM.
Awesome. There will be links to that in the description. And Millennial Mike, where can they find you?
So you can find me on Vero. It's kind of a wasteland, but the app looks really pretty. They have a nice desktop app out too, which Dan has yet to try on his new MacBook,
That's
which
true.
I've been trying to get him to. But yeah, you can find me at Vero on vero.co/Millennial Mike, no spaces. You can also find me on Discord as well. I'm on the Reason I'm Broke Discord. I have my own Discord, the Exiles Network Discord. You can find me on the Exiles Network. I've been doing a lot of work on Ronin Council. You can follow the Ronin Council Twitter page at Ronin Council. I do post my episodes there. I don't do a lot of stuff on Twitter once again because it's terrible. But yeah, mostly Discord and Ronin Council on Twitter if you want to hit me up there.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. And to you, Bobby, as well, for both joining again. Can't say thank you enough. And it's always great to do these retrospectives. Without you guys and without the Brokehead Core, we wouldn't have these. So appreciate everyone that tuned in. If this is your first episode, we do these retrospectives once every month. I try to do them, but sometimes it ends up being once every 2 months, especially since we just got out of the holidays and people's schedules and everything. But otherwise, we're still maintaining that regular weekly schedule that you can enjoy, which is more news-based, based on everything that came out that week, relating to comics, movies, gaming, a lot of what is on our Discord, as Bobby said. You can find the link to all of that at thereasonsimbroke.com. If you're enjoying this episode 30 days after it released on Patreon and you want to enjoy some early access and help vote on the future retrospectives, head on over to patreon.com/thereasonsimbroke. Otherwise, I've been Daniel, joined by Bobby and Millennial Mike, and Brokehead Core. All will be well. All right, I want to get a little fantasy here on if there was an ASM 3. We know we got that slight tease on who the Sinister Six were going to be, but who would you have wanted to see be in that Sinister Six if they had done, or if they do, in an Amazing Spider-Man 3? Bobby, who are your picks?
Like, Kraven's got to be in there. We haven't seen Kraven yet in anything. So that would have been nice to see Kraven, because Kraven is very grounded as a human, and I think Spider-Man would do well with a Kraven. Like, the special effects wouldn't have to be over the top or anything. He's just a dude with a spear and he hunts things, you know. I think they could build a very good story about him hunting down Spider-Man.
Kraven Last Hunt is one of my favorite Spider-Man stories.
Yeah, Last
I
Hunt.
love that.
Last Hunt was so good.
Yeah,
and it's funny because, like, in the current ASM arc in the books, he's come across Kraven again. So every time he comes up, like, it's such a good character. I think Kraven's good. Norman Osborn, but not as Goblin. I don't want to see Goblin. I want to see Norman Osborn.
President Osborn.
Kind of the Dark Avengers Osborn. How about that? The mastermind behind the plot, but not out there fighting Spider-Man hand in hand, because that storyline was more of, I want to find out, because this was after the memory wipe, I want to find out who Peter Parker is. That was his complete motivation for everything he was doing. But not to kill him, just to reveal who he was. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. To reveal who Spider-Man was, not Peter Parker. And I think another good one outside of Kraven and Norman Osborn would be, oh boy, so many different villains. Vulture, but we already had him, obviously. I think Vulture in a different way. Not that I have a problem with the way it was put in Homecoming, but I guess a more defined Vulture. or even a more Sandman.
Mhm.
That's what I was trying to think of. Sandman as well. Sandman's not bad. And if they want to add Hydra Man, which we saw in No Way Home, I'm sorry, Far From Home, I don't think he was done well because that was made up by Mysterio, if I remember correctly, and it wasn't a full-fleshed character. So, but yeah, there's some options. Craven would be my standout, though.
Gotcha. How about you, Millennial Mike? Any standouts?
So Venom.
Is that a joke answer?
Well, okay. So,
So you're a Venom stan. Okay.
Well, okay. So Venom, as he appeared in the first Venom, so I didn't like the second Venom. So me imagine, because this is all imaginary here. So me imagining, I would say if Venom somehow progressed in a slightly different direction from Venom 1 into a more of a villainous figure, I would say, or more anti-hero, a little bit darker figure, I would say that he would be great. I think Tom Hardy does an amazing job, and he definitely fits the acting chops and the tone that we come to expect from the Amazing Spider-Man franchise. Mm-hmm. So I'm big on that idea. Also, Carnage. Of course, having two symbiotes in. I mean, I love the symbiotes. I love the symbiotes. So having two of them in the Sinister Six, I don't know, it might be a little overkill, but I love Carnage as a character. Craven, it was actually going to be one of mine. You stole that.
Oh, I got to say it now. Craving these nuts. I let it go so many times. Bobby said it 3 times, and I was biting my tongue.
I got something you can bite right here.
Yeah. So no, I mean, for sure. The symbiotes, because I love the symbiotes, and then pretty much any of your more grounded Spider-Man, like Black Cat, but she's not really a villain, so she couldn't go so much. Maybe Silver Sable, but she's also not totally a villain either. Mm-hmm. I like the more grounded Spider-Man antagonists. So if we could somehow incorporate those into the Sinister Six, then that'd be great.
Kingpin for me would be another one.
Oh yeah.
Oh, good choice.
I mean, he's better than the Sinister Six. Like he's not. You can't have Kingpin in the Sinister Six. It's stupid. He's too good to be in the Sinister Six.
Or he's the final boss using the Sinister Six.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.